Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar from Curo Compensation. My name's Ruth Thomas and I'm a senior consultant and founder here at Curo, and I'm going to be taking you through this webinar today. So today's topic is all about pay transparency, and we know very much that advancing pay equality is very high on the political agenda both here in the UK and the US, with the focus on driving pay equality by publicly disclosing pay differentials. But today's topic, I wanted to really focus more broadly on about the whole area of pay transparency and what you can do to make that a reality within your own organisation. So in terms of the agenda for today, I'm just going to take you through some quick introductions and housekeeping actions before getting on to today's topic, where I'm going to look at how we've got to where we've got to today in terms of pay transparency, what have been the key drivers and some of the key principles that you need to think about in your own organisations. The session runs for the strict 30 minutes, so we keep questions to the end so I can get through the material. You are actually all on mute from a housekeeping perspective, so none of you should be able to talk. And if you do want to submit a question at the end, then you can do that using the chat button, which should be in the Join Me panel that you should have displayed on your screen somewhere. So if you just type in the question, and I will attempt to answer those if you've got any that you want to share at the end of the session. If you don't want to do that, but you still have some burning questions that you wish to ask, then you can email those in. And you can also request a copy of the deck that I'm sharing today. And we are recording the session, so you can also request a copy of the link to the recording. And Carol is your contact point for that. So Carol leads our marketing activities here at Curo, and she's hopefully invited you all to attend today. And so she will be the person for you to get back in contact again in terms of asking for copies of the deck or the recording. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quick introduction to Curo, the company, for those of you who don't know what we do. So essentially, we're an HR technology solution provider, and our product, Curo for Comp, is a SaaS-based best-of-breed total compensation management solution. And we work with companies managing their compensation processes and their complex requirements in terms of reward. Our product is standalone, best of breed, so it works seamlessly across all HR platforms in order to manage our clients' complexity. And we have a broad client base across all sectors, so we don't specialise in any particular sector. And we have a strong client community who've all worked with us to help us to evolve that SaaS product and make sure that it's that best of breed solution. And I'm going to share with you some of our client base, examples of them. If you'd like to find out any more information about the clients that we work with, any case studies, or about our product, then you can get back in touch with us, or you can obviously have a look at our website, curocomp.com, and you'll find lots of useful information there. So on to today's topic and the main content for this webinar, and I'm going to start thinking about the evolution of pay transparency and how it's come to the prevalence that it has done today. Well, it's definitely been a rapid evolution, particularly over the last few years. I mean, if I look back over the 25 years that I've been managing reward, it's a completely seismic change. It was probably not that long ago that it was quite common for every pay review letter or pay slip to be labelled with the ominous words, details of your pay are strictly private and confidential and should only be discussed with your manager. And it actually used to be a disciplinary offence to disclose your pay. In the UK, the Equality Act from 2010 changed all that by outlawing pay secrecy here. And so companies could no longer forbid employees from talking about their salaries. And in the US, pay secrecy legislation is evolving too, both at a state and national level. But in the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen some more progressive companies moving to complete pay transparency, and that is sometimes called open salaries. Whole Foods is probably one of the oldest companies, or the companies that have one of the companies that have been using an open salaries approach for the longest. So they make it very easy for staff to be able to look up anyone's salary or bonus from the previous year, all the way from the CEO level downwards. And this was actually introduced by their CEO, John Mackey, because he thought it would help if workers could understand what types of performance and achievement earn certain people more money, and that would prove motivation to others to be successful too. So it was more done from a motivational point of view. You could jump forward a bit to Buffer, who are probably one of the best known advocates of open salaries, or the most publicly known. They used this approach, started using this approach 3 years ago in an effort to provide full transparency to both its employees, team members and customers. And for them, transparency is a key corporate value. And you can see that all over their website if you want to go and visit their website. And they publish their open salaries approach publicly. So this is a formula for deriving each employee's pay, which you can find if you have a look on the internet. But they also report each individual salaries for all employees and for the general public to be able to see. Netflix is another example of a company that's adopted some key policies to ensure compensation is transparent. They are very clear about how they determine compensation within the organization, and they have a top of market test that they use to apply to all employees, and they publish how they go about that as well, so you can find that easily. And they also have a policy where they say they will pay top of market rate. The other couple of examples I'm going to mention here are where the movement towards open salaries hasn't necessarily been led by the organization. So Google's probably a good example of that, and some of the dangers of not being transparent. So you may have heard that back in 2015, there was a Google engineer, Erica Baker, who created a spreadsheet where employees could compare their salaries, and she shared that internally at Google, and about 5% of the workforce participated. And what that did show in that sort of public disclosure of salaries was the systematic compensation disparities between men and women. And what that's led to this year is, in January, the Department of Labor in the US have actually sued Google because it is one of their government contractors into releasing salary data and documents to investigate those disparities. So, you know, it may not necessarily be you, the organization, that drives that move to pay transparency. There was a similar campaign, that #TalkPay campaign, also in 2015. That was a Twitter campaign led by a lady called Lauren Voswinkel, and she was basically mounting a protest, encouraging people to post their job titles and salary information on Twitter with that hashtag. And that was really aimed at highlighting pay inequality. So you can see, you know, we've got this movement towards more open pay disclosure. And it's a very big change from where we were, you know, less than 10 years ago. So how did we get there? Well, I'm going to focus on these key points just for the next couple of minutes. And I think we can start to see, you know, some of the clues from this coming from the financial crash back in 2008 and the events that have happened since then. One issue is the suppressed wage growth that we've experienced since then. So the recession definitely, you know, had a corrosive impact on employees' perceptions of reward and fairness and equity, with pay freezes and all the disclosures that came out at that time around bankers' pay, executive pay, was all, you know, had a negative effect. And employers really since then have had to work really hard to regain employees' trust in reward systems. And that's been difficult because of this suppressed wage growth. And I've just included a couple of trend charts there for you. But what's been difficult is managing pay differentiation with such small pay budgets. And that's been particularly challenging for most employers. So what we have seen is more employers having to communicate more openly about how they are distributing those limited budgets. So the fact that they've got less money to spend, you know, they're needing to be more open about how they're allocating their pay in order to engage employees and retain key talent within the organisation. Another key factor that has driven this pay transparency movement is definitely reward governance. And this was, you know, another feature that has happened as a result of the recession. We've seen legislation emerge initially in the financial services sector, but now impacting across all sectors. And the overriding theme here is greater transparency in how and what people are being paid. And shareholders and stakeholders all want to know that compensation is being risk aligned and how pay is being allocated relative to business results and performance. So governance definitely had a role to play in this process. But there are some more macro level issues as well. We can't deny, we're definitely in the information age, largely technology driven, but pay transparency seems almost inevitable in today's age of information sharing. And you've got platforms like Glassdoor and PayScale, where any employee or potential employee can get access to pay rate and job information. And although many of us choose not to share our pay data, the ease of access to pay information is undoubtedly driving the demand for pay transparency. And linked to that is obviously the change in employee expectations around this subject. So, we've heard a lot about millennial population in the workplace and how organisations are having to rethink their engagement strategies in order to manage millennial employees. And it seems to be that if you want to retain millennials, honesty seems to be the way to go. And today's younger professionals have firmly rooted opinions on what they want to know about their workplaces. And they've also grown up in a time where information has become available instantly. So they're much more inclined to share pay information. They have less worries about that in order to see how they stack up and determine if they are being paid fairly. And that isn't necessarily true across all age groups in the workforce. But what we're seeing drive pay transparency now and going forward is going to be the legislation that's emerging and the public debates about pay gaps. So that's extending that awareness across all employee groups, across the workforce, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops over the next few years. So we've looked at how pay transparency has evolved and how we got there. I'm now going to focus on sort of the key principles that you need to think about in terms of achieving pay transparency in your own organisations. And I'm going to start with fairness and the concept of fairness and reward. So when we look at employee engagement, the impact of reward on employee retention, fairness is a critical thing here. A lot of research supports the theory that the reasons people leave an employer for reasons relating to pay is not about the absolute value. It's not about how much I've been paid, but it's more over the perception of whether that I was paid fairly relative to my peers or relative to market. So it's that perception of fairness over reward that tends to see employees leaving an organisation. But fairness and employee perceptions are really difficult to manage. Employee perceptions are often different from the reality, and you can see that in this study that I've included here. This was published in the Harvard Business Review back in October 2015, based on a pay scale survey of over 71,000 employees. And you can see what it's showing you here is looking at people paid above market, at market, and below market, and how they thought they were paid actually in reality relative to market. So all those people paid above market, you can see only 21% of them thought they were actually being paid at that level. And then looking at market, you can see that only 30% of people thought they were actually being paid at market. It was only when you get down to the below market level that the views of how the employee was paid relative to how they were actually paid seem to align. That may have something to do with the fact that most of us probably think we're never actually paid enough. But it does show that judging fairness is difficult, and one person's perception can be very different from someone else's. And in fact, fairness is probably too emotive to really truly quantify. But the key issue for you to think about is that you need to make sure that your policies are equitable, and that what matters to employees isn't about pay being equal, but that the system for awarding pay is fair and ensures equity. And I'll come back to that difference between equal and equity later on. Another key principle to think about is trust. And trust really, transparency tends to breed trust between employers and employees. We know from millennial employees, in fact, for many employees' expectations today, that trust is one of the key engagement factors between employers and employees. And we know also that trust is really important for team working, and the need to work collaboratively is becoming much more crucial. So breaking down any areas of mistrust, particularly with regard to pay, can help here. And Dane Atkinson, who is CEO at Sumall, this is another technology company who've moved to a more open approach to managing pay. So they share salaries internally. They don't share them externally, but all employees within the organisation can see how they're paid relative to each other. And you can see here what he thinks is important is, if employees can see where they fit financially against their peers, then it tends to eliminate the guesswork and creates a more open environment, and it sort of reduces the aggravation and any frustrations that there may be around pay. It can help to reduce the friction or noise and hopefully generate a more open and trusting environment. And it'd be interesting to think about how many of you feel that the employees in your organisation would say that they trust the decision that went behind their last pay increase. The other key principle here is obviously pay equity. And as I said at the beginning of this session, we know that identifying pay differentials and addressing them is going to be high on the agenda for many of us this year. But it's really not about time. If you think that in the US, the Equal Pay Act was actually passed in 1963, and in the UK it was passed in 1970. So it really is high time that we did get our house in order. And much of the current legislation in relation to pay transparency is based on the belief that transparency will drive action, which, to be honest, to date has been happening at too slow a pace. And there are various estimates about how long it will actually take to reduce the gender pay gap, for example, and there are some commentators actually debating whether public disclosure will do that. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens here. In London on May the 10th, we are going to be holding another one of our breakfast briefing sessions, and we've got Duncan Brown from the IES coming to address this topic, and he's going to be giving us his views on how we can really progress addressing gender pay gap and whether some of the actions that are proposed will achieve that. But it is undisputable that we need to act now really to address pay equity, as greater challenges are coming down the line, and we will end up with a much more diverse workforce than we have today. So some key thoughts around achieving pay transparency. Well, it is one of the least researched areas of employee engagement, but if you can get there, the general feeling is that pay transparency can boost productivity and engagement. And ultimately, we're hoping that it will drive pay equality. And I've included at the end of this pack some links to some of the studies that you can look at around links between pay transparency and productivity and engagement. And as I said at the beginning, those of you who joined slightly late, you can request a copy of the deck from Carol if you want to get access to that research. I know that it's sometimes debated about whether reward actually does have a direct link to employee engagement, or whether really reward is just a simple hygiene factor. But I think the important point to note that if pay is not managed correctly, as in cash, then it will ultimately undermine all your other engagement efforts. And that's really supported by this motivation crowding theory. I don't know if any of you have heard of it before. It's worth having a look at, but this focuses on the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic reward as motivators. And it's focusing on saying, actually, probably in today's working environment, intrinsic reward is rising in importance. But if you don't get the extrinsic part right, so that's the cash part right, then what it ultimately does is it ends up crowding out your efforts on anything else. So you cannot ignore the impact of salary and bonus in terms of impacting employee engagement. But if you are thinking about starting this journey, then there are some things you need to be aware of. Jumping into an open salary approach isn't necessarily right for everybody, and it is quite a big step. It really needs to be aligned with your company culture. So I know for some organisations where there are large numbers of historical factors impacting pay rates, it can be very difficult. But you may not want to go completely down the route of open salaries, but where you should be aiming for is publishing aggregate information or making it clear to those involved in the process how pay is being determined. So both to employees and to managers making compensation decisions. And really think about demystifying compensation within your organisation. Another thing to think about is that once you go down this route, there is no real off switch. So once you go down the route of introducing pay transparency, you are going to have to continue on that journey. And you also are going to have to report progress on the issues identified, because people are going to expect to see some action resulting from this. And you need to make sure that internally you're ready for some tough conversations. So you're going to need fresh, credible data on how you make pay decisions and be able to show how you are making sure those decisions are being made equally. But I think we're all clear on, what the goal is here. We're all trying to focus on equitable and marketable competitive pay that's awarded in a fair and transparent manner, and ultimately to those who contribute the most to your organisation. So I guess the point I've been trying to make here is paying people more doesn't improve employee engagement, but paying people fairly does. And that's what I want you, I guess, to have as a key takeaway from this session. And I've put here a suggested checklist for your organisation in terms of, am I approaching fair reward in the right way? If you can answer yes to most of these questions, then you're probably equipping yourselves well for the challenge. But if not, then you're probably going to need to look at each of these actions individually. But it is making sure that you have a clear reward strategy and that employees and those involved in the process understand what that reward strategy is. It may be important for your organisation to have internal job levels and allow you to assign roles and use some form of job evaluation, but that is very much coming under debate at the moment in terms of how we should measure an employee's contribution to the organisation in terms of whether we're actually measuring a job or whether we're measuring the input that an employee brings to that role in terms of their skills. That's not something I'm going to delve into a lot of detail here. You need to think about your benchmarking data and think about communicating pay structures to employees, and make sure that your employees know how to progress their pay. So what do they have to do in order to increase their pay within the organisation? If you haven't done so already, you should think about equal pay audits and starting your gender pay gap analysis. So we know in the UK, for example, the legislation, the first reporting date came into effect from the 6th of April. And if you haven't done your analysis yet, then it's definitely worth thinking about doing that now. I know many organisations are undertaking that activity now and starting to think about when they will publicly disclose those. A lot of people talking about waiting until the autumn here in the UK to do that. So I think it will probably not be till the summer onwards that we start to see that information being disclosed in the public domain. It's worth having a look, generally wherever you use discretion in pay decisions, taking a close look at that for any gender bias. And also this more recent movement is making sure that your managers understand what unconscious bias is in your organisation. So I haven't focused on gender pay in this particular session, it's sort of specific to the UK, but I have included in this deck a couple of slides in terms of how you might go about a gender pay gap action plan, and some of the considerations you need to have in terms of tackling the information that you get out of that analysis. And as I said, we are holding our next Comp and Coffee in May here in the UK, and we'll also publish the materials from that on the latest thinking on that. But I guess, I did want to leave you with a final point around technology and how that can help you with this process. So the reality is when it comes to making pay decisions, it's difficult to ever be wholly objective. Ultimately, we're making a decision about people and how they interact in organisations, and there will always be some form of subjective judgment in that. For example, if you take a decision on hiring or promotion, you're really relying on your judgments about that person's potential for their future. But there are definitely some clear benefits from using technology to support your reward programs in terms of helping you manage pay transparency. It goes without saying that you can automate and simplify your processes and hopefully give you more time to focus on how rewards are being allocated and making sure that they're being allocated fairly. But you can help those making those subjective decisions, help them make them more balanced by providing them with more quality information. So quite often, we see with organisations that we start working with, they're dealing with spreadsheets that are probably, 100, 200 columns long, and actually making sense of that information is very hard, and making informed decisions is something that's not easy to come to. So a lot of what we do working with our clients is unlocking the potential of their compensation data in order to drive business outcomes and help us in the role of HR and reward to fulfill that role of evidence-based business enablers. And another thing to think about really in terms of where we go moving forwards is, we're going to want to be able to provide our managers with more and more information about employees in order to make effective pay decisions. So there's more talk about moving from pay for performance through to pay for talent, potentially considering other talent metrics, and then also more information around pay equity. And that's going to be hard to do in spreadsheets. So really you need to think about looking at the BI capabilities within technology that are going to help you on that process. So definitely technology will be able to help you on that journey. So as I mentioned earlier, I've included a link to some of the articles that we've published here at Curo on pay transparency and a link to some of the research that I've referenced in that, because I often get questions on that after the event. So if you ask for a copy of this deck, you'll be able to get hold of all of that. And I'm now just going to open the floor to any questions, see if anybody's got anything immediately they want to ask. Again, just from a housekeeping perspective, you're on mute, but you should be able to submit a question using the chat box in the Join Me panel at the top. And I'll have a look for those. Or if you don't want to do that now, please do email in any questions and I will answer those for you. So if you get back in touch with Carol at Curo to ask any questions and ask for a copy of the deck and ask for a copy of the link to the recording. So I'm just going to leave it there for a couple of minutes, see if anybody's got any questions. Okay, one question I've got coming in was, I did just address this earlier, is do we know when in the UK companies will be publishing their gender pay gap data? So I don't know definitively, but from talking to people in the market and talking to some of our clients, I know that it's something that people are going to be looking to do from late summer onwards. So I think a lot of people have already done the analysis and they used that as they went into their pay reviews this year in order to try and address disparities. But a lot of people are doing that analysis post this latest review. It will take them a while, obviously, to work through how to address those challenges and what they want to commit to in terms of an action plan, and then getting executive buy-in for that. And then, probably by the time we get to summer, autumn, publishing that. Okay, any additional questions? Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. I mentioned during the session, this is our next event in the UK, in London. We've got Duncan Brown, who leads the consultancy practice for the Institute of Employment Studies, coming to talk to us. And he's going to be focusing on gender pay gap reporting specifically in that session. So if there's something you want to find out more about that, please do come along to that event. It's publicised on our website. We look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, these are our general contact details, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much, everybody.